Israelite history. Today I'll be giving a message about my second book in the series, which is called Israel's Lost Empires. After learning about history from the perspective of the 10 tribes of Israel, which is what you learn when you read my books, you can have faith in the Bible, not in spite of the historical record, but because of it. As you can see, there's complete union between the biblical narratives and what secular history has to say. And by the way, I'm completely comfortable with the usage of the divine names in either English or the Hebrew usages, and I will probably interchange them back and forth some in my message. My book, Israel's Lost Empires, covers a lot of historical ground. It begins by presenting evidence that the United Kingdom of ancient Israel under David and Solomon was a global world power, not some backward shepherd kingdom. It is vital to establish the original power and size of the kingdom of the Israelites before discussing its subsequent lost empires that were formed after the tribes were exiled. My book then examines the many different paths that the Israelite tribes took as they exited the Promised Land in their exile. The Bible promised they would be widely scattered among the nations, and that came to pass. My book then presents evidence about two specific Israelite empires which reigned for many centuries before they were overthrown. Both of these empires were founded long before the Parthian Empire, which I discussed last year, came into existence. One of the empires I'll mention today was dying out, just as Parthia rose to power, and the other continued alongside of Parthia and was a powerful ally of it. And this message will only have time to give the high points of the topics in my book. I'd like to start with 3 misconceptions, which should be the second slide appearing on the screen overhead, that most people have about the 10 tribes. The first misconception is the tribes all went into captivity when Israel fell about 721 BC. The second misconception is that the 10 tribes became lost nomads who could no longer be identified. The last one is that God or Yahweh permanently forsook them. All these assumptions are completely false, based on both biblical and secular evidence. Now, in Hosea 1, Yahweh said he would punish Israel, that means the 10 tribes, by expelling all of them from their promised land. This was God's pronouncement of judgment upon them for the accumulated sins they had. However, in verse 10 of Hosea 1, God also promised to so vastly increase the population of the 10 tribes after they were removed from the promised land that their numbers would become like the sand of the sea. So they were to be vastly expanded in population after Yahweh sent them into exile. Hosea 1 is a very important chapter. It actually shows there are 2 covenants between God and the tribes of Israel. While God was driving them off the land for their sins, this affirmed the punishments of the covenant made between Yahweh and Israel via Moses. His promise to vastly increase their numbers after he exiled them affirmed a blessing of the covenant made between Yahweh and Abraham regarding Abraham's birthright descendants. The blessings and cursings of the covenant with Moses were conditional on the tribe's obedience to the divine commandments. But the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant were unconditional. That was based on Abraham's obedience and faith. Now, the Abrahamic covenant included many blessings, which I'll just run through very quickly on the screen here. In Genesis 13, 15 to 16, it included again that huge number of descendants, which Hosea 1:10 referred to. Genesis 17, verses 4 and 6, refers to the fact that Abraham would be the father of many nations, not just one, and that he would also father dynasties of kings. In Genesis 22:17, his descendants are again promised to be as numerous as the stars of heaven and the sand of the sea, which again harkens right back to Hosea 1:10's prophecy later on. And also that the nations descended from Abraham would possess the gates of their enemies, key choke points in the geography of the earth. It also included a promise that Abraham's birthright descendants would bear the name of Isaac upon them. And that we find in Genesis 21:12, which is a very important clue for locating Abraham's birthright descendants throughout history. It says, "In Isaac will your seed be called or be named." So we should expect that name of Isaac to follow the birthright descendants. This is affirmed twice in the New Testament. I won't dwell time on it, but on the screen you should see Hebrews 11:18 and Romans 9, verses 7 to 8. The writers of those books affirmed That was a covenant that God was still going to be implementing in New Testament times. Now, the covenant between God and Abraham was passed down to Isaac, then to Jacob, who was renamed Israel, and in Genesis 48 to the sons of Joseph. That's Ephraim and Manasseh. Now, let's examine both scriptural and secular evidence to confirm that Hosea's prophecy came to pass after the tribe's exile from the land. In Jeremiah 3 is a chapter which was written about a century after Samaria fell. So this is when the 10 tribes are gone. Judah, at least a remnant of it, is still there around Jerusalem. But Yahweh sent Jeremiah with a message to both Israel and to Judah at that time, showing that Yahweh had clearly not forsaken Israel because he was giving Jeremiah a message to send to them, even after their removal from the Promised Land. Now in verses 11 to 12 of Jeremiah 3, it says, this is quoting God, saying, "Backsliding Israel has justified herself more than treacherous Judah. Go and proclaim these words toward the north, and say, return, backsliding Israel. I am merciful, and I will not keep my anger forever." Now, I'm coming back to this, so if you want, keep your finger there if you're going through a Bible. But look at Jeremiah 51:5, which was written perhaps 125 years after Samaria fell. There, Yahweh flatly declares, Israel has not been forsaken. That's referring to the 10 tribes of Israel. It says, Israel has not been forsaken, nor Judah, of the Lord of hosts. So those saying that God forsook the 10 tribes when he expelled them from the Holy Lands have totally overlooked this verse. Over a century after their expulsion from the Holy Land, Yahweh is categorically declaring he has not forsaken the 10 tribes. He couldn't forsake them. The covenant he made with Abraham was eternally binding, and it was unconditional. And that was what was referred to in Hosea 1:10, where God was telling them, I'm still going to be keeping that covenant of Abraham with you, even in exile. So the covenant with Abraham was in effect long before the covenant with Moses was ever made. So the covenant with Abraham was not affected by what happened under the terms of the covenant with Moses. Now, Yahweh still had promised to keep about Abraham's descendants, and he always keeps his promises. Those who say that he forsook the Israelites are actually asserting that Yahweh reneged on his covenant with Abraham, which he couldn't possibly do. Back in Jeremiah 3, verse 14, Yahweh says to Israel and Judah, I am married to you. So Yahweh refers to his relationship with Israel and Judah as a covenant relationship, which it was. Now, there's more in Jeremiah yet, in this chapter 3. If all Israelites had gone into captivity in Assyria, that's to the east of the old promised land in Mesopotamia, Yahweh would have said in Jeremiah 3:12, proclaim this message toward the east, Jeremiah. But the Creator knew that the main body of Israelites were not in Assyria. He knew they were north of Jerusalem, and he said, proclaim this message to the north. And this is one of the factors of ancient history that people have overlooked in following the 10 tribes. If you draw a line north of Jerusalem, and you come to the Black Sea region of the people that were called the Sake Scythians, you'll see that straight north up by the Black Sea, and we'll be talking a great deal about them later. But now Daniel 7 also confirms that Daniel knew that by his lifetime the 10 tribes had been widely scattered, many locations throughout the world. Is in his prayer in Daniel 9, where he's confessing the sins of his people, both of Israel and Judah, he says in verse 7, he refers to all Israel that are near and that are far off, through all the countries, plural, where you have driven them. So Daniel knew that the 10 tribes had been driven into many different countries by the time of his life, and that some of them still lived very near Daniel. Those are the ones that would have been taken captive by Assyria to the cities of the Medes by the Assyrians, but later on the Persian Empire replaced them, of course. But Daniel was still living in the cities of the Medes of the Medo-Persian Empire at that time. But the Israelites that were afar off in other locations were the ones that didn't go into an Assyrian captivity, which we'll talk more about later. They kept control of their destiny, even though they were exiled. But in both Jeremiah and Daniel's time, the whereabouts of the 10 tribes was still known to the prophets and people of God. Genesis 49 includes specific prophecies about each one of the tribes in the latter days, which I believe is our time that we're living in right now. But it clearly shows that whatever you think the latter days are, all of the tribes of Israel are going to be alive and on the earth during that time, because the book of Genesis gives us clues for locating them. And my books follow those clues. Now, Ezekiel 37 also has a prophecy regarding the 2 sticks, about the 2 houses of Israel and Judah, which will remain separate throughout history and not be reunited until the Messianic age begins. Revelation 7 includes a prophecy about a mysterious group called the 144,000. But these are all Israelites from each of the tribes of Israel on earth at the end of the age. So the Bible, in several places, prophesies that the 10 tribes of Israel absolutely must be found among the nations in the latter days. If they died out, the Bible has failed, and we're wasting our time. But as my books point out, you can trace them very easily and see that God has kept his promises about them throughout history and today. Now let's look at some secular sources that also give information on where the Israelites went after their empire fell under David Solomon. Josephus, the famous Jewish writer of the 1st century A.D., had, I believe, Hosea 1 in mind when he wrote regarding the 10 tribes of Israel, and that should be up on the screen giving the appropriate part of his book where he writes this. Josephus wrote, "There are but 2 tribes in Asia and Europe subject to the Romans, while the 10 tribes are beyond Euphrates till now, and are an immense multitude, not to be estimated by numbers." So that shows that the prophecy of Hosea 1:10 had already been fulfilled and was being fulfilled by the time of Josephus' lifetime, that they were too big to count. Josephus confirmed the blessing of great population increases that were part of that Abrahamic covenant. So as of the 1st century A.D., when our Savior lived, the 10 tribes of Israel were not lost. Educated Jews such as Josephus knew exactly who they were and where they were. Also in Matthew 10, verses 5 to 6, Yeshua himself said he was sending the apostles to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. That's the 10 tribes. Yeshua's assignment didn't seem to surprise any of them at all. They knew the addresses to which they were being sent. It was common knowledge at that time. Now, one reason people can't find the 10 tribes of Israel in history is they incorrectly use a minimalist approach, assuming that all they're going to find are scattered little remnants. Well, that's quite wrong. Hosea 1 tells us that we must use a maximalist approach for finding the 10 tribes. We have to look for them among the large nations of the earth who will be enjoying the specific Abrahamic covenant blessings. There was a man called Ortelius, who was a 16th century geographer in Europe. He wrote that the Israelites of the 10 tribes migrated to the Caucasus mountain region and that they took the name Gothi. Later on, that was spelled by the Romans as Goths, who later on became known as Visigoths and Ostrogoths, but these people had an Israelite origin. Eldad, who was a medieval Jewish writer, wrote, "Many of the Israelites did not go into captivity." Now that's referring to the Assyrian captivity. But it says they evaded the calamity, going off with their flocks, and that the chief or prince whom they appointed could muster 120,000 horsemen and 100,000 foot soldiers. So with 220,000 armed men escorting this band of Israelites that was migrating out of the old Promised Land and heading north to the Caucasus Mountains, the entire band had to number 2 or 3 million when you include all the numbers of wives, children, the elderly, etc. So the concept that the 10 tribes of Israel were lost is a fairly recent concept. Even in medieval times, people knew the Israelites had fled north to the Caucasus Mountains to evade the Assyrian captivity. Now, under King David and Solomon, Israel was a world power in the ancient times. This has been lost track of because King David and Solomon's history is so old to our perspective. They were ancient history at the time the Roman Empire was on earth. Remember that Kings David and Solomon were allied to the Phoenicians of Tyre and Sidon. The Bible records that they practically merged their societies with the alliance under King Hiram, and they merged their navy fleets into one entity. Now, secular history tells us that the Phoenician Empire was the dominant empire on earth from around 1000 to approximately 700 BC. Now that happens to also be the exact period of time from Kings David and Solomon around 1000 BC to just after the Israelites fled that region. So the real power of the Phoenician Empire was the Israelites at that particular time. The small city-states of Tyre and Sidon reverted to a much smaller status in the world after the Israelites left. Now, there's much evidence in my books that the Israelites were present in ancient North America. They had a 20-acre temple site to Baal and other pagan deities in New England. This is, maybe some of you have seen the program called America's Stonehenge on cable TV, which just shows the foundations of the buildings that's all that's left now. Because the colonists, when they came to the New World from Europe, dismantled them because they needed those stoneworks to build their own structures. A trilingual artifact, much like the Rosetta Stone, dating to about 800 to 600 BC, was found near Davenport, Iowa, up in my area of the Midwest. It had ancient Egyptian and Semitic inscriptions on it, showing parallel accounts in different languages. The Israelites were also present in South America, as the Phoenicians were known to be extremely good mariners and sailed all over the world, far more than we give them credit for now. One nation in South America was known as the Island of Iron by the Hebrews and the Phoenicians. Now, for those of you who know Hebrew, the Hebrew word for iron is barzel. We don't have the vowels, but the consonants were B-R-Z-L. Can you think of a nation in South America today that has those consonants? Well, that's Brazil. And Brazil is still an iron ore exporting region. And Brazil, although people do not realize it, is still known by the Hebrew name given to it during the times of David and Solomon, when it was named after iron. Now, Yahweh's followers were here in North America, too. An Ohio River mound builder grave was dug up in 1860, the year the Civil War began, and it had an artifact with the Ten Commandments in ancient Hebrew found in it. Photos of the original artifact and other artifacts found with it are in my books, as I had permission from the museum to reproduce the photographs in it. So it's in that book I'm talking about today. The Ten Commandments were also written in ancient Hebrew on a large slab in the New Mexico desert along a dry riverbed that once flowed into the Rio Grande. I've been there, inspected it, and a wide variety of photos of this incredible artifact and other Hebrew inscriptions in that region are in my new books. Now, this artifact has the ancient Paleo-Hebrew script, which would have prevailed about the time of David and Solomon, not the post-captivity script. My book cites evidence that it dates to the time of King Solomon, and there's an extensive photo gallery of this artifact at my website, which is www.stephenmcollins.com, Stephen spelled with a V. But there's also an explanation of the Ten Commandments inscription and the other Hebrew inscriptions that have been found in that region at my website. Now, the term Phoenicia was a Greek term given to the allied nations living between Turkey and Egypt along the East Mediterranean. That included Israel, Tyre, Sidon, and then later Judah would have lived there too. The Bible tells us King David's army reached the Euphrates River, which made him a neighbor of Assyria. Did you realize the Bible and secular history record a tremendous secret? That King David conquered the Assyrian Empire. 1 Chronicles 19 describes a great war where the Israelite army was faced by an alliance of many nations. It calls them the Syrians and the Mesopotamian kings who came to destroy Israel. It even talks about the Mesopotamian kings being so certain of victory, they set up their seats to watch the battle. The Mesopotamians were the Assyrians. Assyria ruled Mesopotamia, and all the other Mesopotamian kings would have been their vassals. Well, the Israelites won this war, but keep in mind David's forces were already at the Euphrates River. So as they were pursuing the fleeing Assyrians, invading Assyria was just one step across the river. Secular histories record that Assyria was invaded, defeated, and occupied by an invading Semitic army from the west during the reign of King David. I have the secular sources quoted in my book. Those Semites had to be the Israelites. David wrote of this war in Psalm 83, where he mentions a great alliance, including Assyria, which he calls Asher, which fought Israel and helped the children of Lot. Now, that 1 Chronicles 19 war began with a rebellion against Israel by the Ammonites, the children of Lot. who hired Asher and the Mesopotamians in Syria. But I can't linger there. You can get the story about this in the book. The prophet Nathan gave David a message from Yahweh wherein he stated to David, I have made you a great name, like unto the great men that are in the earth. David was one of the dominant kings of the ancient world, not a minor monarch of a shepherd kingdom. He belongs up there with Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, and other conquerors. And during the Messianic age, his true history and the size of his empire will be revealed to all. Now, one part of the answer where all the Israelites went during the exile becomes easy when we realize the kingdom of Israel was the home kingdom of the Phoenician Empire. Israel, then, as what we call the Phoenicians, had many colonies in Europe, Africa, the British Isles, even in North America. My book includes much information from the books of the late Dr. Barry Fell, a Harvard professor, who wrote 3 books documenting that the Hebrews, Carthaginians, Egyptians, Romans, and even Islamic Arabs were here in North America. The late Dr. Cyrus Gordon, one of the most famous archaeologists ever, wrote a book called Before Columbus, in which he strongly states that the evidence that the Israelites and other ancient cultures were present in North America is overwhelming. He declared one popular artifact called the Bat Creek Stone to be a valid example of an ancient Hebrew inscription in the American Southeast. He notes the Smithsonian Institute first rejected it as Hebrew because they were trying to read it upside down. Hebrew language coins have also been found in the Ozarks region of the United States. This evidence is described in detail in my books. Now, one very interesting piece of evidence is that the ancient copper mines by Lake Michigan were worked to exhaustion around 1000 BC. And as Dr. Fell's book points out, there's no evidence where it went. It used in our continent. Now, the Bible gives us the answer, I believe, where it says King David was told, as you remember, that he could not build the temple, but he was allowed to amass all the materials for the temple that Solomon would build. And it says King David amassed copper beyond counting it around 1000 BC for the temple of God, the exact time the copper mines of Lake Michigan were mined to exhaustion. So this copper had to come from outside Israel, as there wasn't enough copper to be mined in the Promised Land. My book offers the evidence that the Phoenician Israelite Empire constructed special vessels to transport massive quantities of raw ores and materials over the ocean. Dr. Fell even writes of a Phoenician inscription that was dug up off the coast of Maine, saying, "Ships of Phoenicia, cargo platform." That was the inscription, as evidence that Phoenician ships had regularly scheduled trips across the Atlantic. Now, secular history records that Assyria was very weak for a century during the reign of King David and Solomon, and shortly thereafter, until a great biblical event occurred which allowed Assyria to recover its strength. 2 Chronicles 13:17 tells us about a horrible civil war between Israel and Judah, in which 500,000 Israelite soldiers died. We don't even know how many casualties Judah had, but 500,000 Israelite men died in that war. This weakened Israel terribly, and they had to pull back their garrison troops from all over their empire. It had to shrink back toward the Promised Land, and this allowed Assyria to recover in a vacuum. This also explains why Assyria angrily kept invading Israel until it fell. Assyria was actually seeking revenge for Israel's early defeat and occupation of Assyria. The Israelites controlled Gibraltar for many centuries, one of the gates of the enemies. Now, Spain was an Israelite colony that called Iberia. The consonants there are the consonants of the word Eber, who was the namesake of the Hebrews or Hebrews. The British Isles had Israelite colonies and have had the name Britain on them for 3,000 years, Brit being, of course, the Hebrew word for covenant. So even today in our modern world, the British Isles have the name covenant stamped on them in Hebrew. This information is necessary so you can see that the birthright descendants of Abraham were already world powers by the time of David, so that when they scattered across the face of the earth, it's not illogical at all to see that these numerous people set up new empires of their own. A couple of the clues we'll keep in mind in tracing the 10 tribes is Phoenicia's empire had that name BRT, which they put on Britain, for the covenant. They knew they were the covenant people, and they called themselves that in place names and on their coins. The second clue is Assyrian records tell us the Israelites were called the Bet Sak, or the house of Isaac, known to other people. Amos 7:16 confirms this. In there it refers to the house of Israel, meaning the 10 tribes, as being the house of Isaac. So it's important to note that even before they scattered from the promised land, they were being known by the name of Isaac, which Genesis 21:12 had prophesied. So where did they all go? Well, the Assyrians only claimed about a paltry 27,000 captives when Samaria fell. 2 Kings 17, verses 5 to 6 and 25, shows that the land of Israel had been abandoned by its people. It had reverted to the wild. It talks about lions overrunning the land, and there has to be an awful lot of prey animals for lions to overrun the land, which means there aren't any people there hunting it. It says the king of Assyria went up and down the land of Israel, and there's no word that he found anybody anywhere other than the ones who stayed in Samaria. The people who stayed in Samaria either were the diehards that wouldn't quit and stayed with the last king of Israel who died there, or they were like heroic ones who did an Alamo battle and pinned down the Assyrian Empire in its rear while the rest of them migrated northward. We don't know the truth on which it was. But the Israelites numbered about 3 million when they left Egypt out of the Exodus. They certainly had increased their numbers when they entered their promised land. The Bible, in one census, tells us David had over 1 million able-bodied men in his army, and of course he wasn't even allowed to include the Levites in the total. So there's a lot of Israelites unaccounted for in the Bible's listing of the tribes that went into captivity. 2 Kings 15:29 indicates that many Israelites went into captivity about 20 years before Samaria fell. These were the tribes of Gilead, which was Reuben, Gad, and a half of the tribe of Manasseh, as well as Naphtali. Those tribes were about a third or so of the Israelites. Then the people of Samaria were only about 27,000 survivors, so that was just a small rear guard. This leaves about two-thirds of the nations, of the tribes of Israel, unaccounted for. The Bible simply doesn't say specifically where they went, but it doesn't say they went into an Assyrian captivity, although we do know they all went into exile. Now remember, Daniel said that the 10 tribes were very widely scattered among the countries in his lifetime. Well, one part of the answer is easy when we remember that the kingdom of Israel in the Phoenician period was a maritime empire with huge fleets sailing the seas. And Israel had colonies in several continents. It is known the Phoenicians were able to navigate by the stars, but what about during cloudy and stormy weather? I mean, you have to know where you're going if you have a schedule to keep. My books cite a 1910 book which revealed the answer, that the Phoenicians had an ingenious invention called a water compass. They would place magnetic lodestones in a basin of water and mark them so that they could always know magnetic north. In other words, they had compasses in there in a gyroscopically centered way as best as they could do it in a basin of water to always know where magnetic north was. So they could keep a schedule and sail even in cloudy, stormy weather. Now back to those Israelites just before the last Assyrian invasion. Put yourself in their position. About a third of the nation has already been taken captive. The prophets are telling you it's over, that the Assyrians are coming and your nation is going to fall. And the handwriting's on the wall. You either have the choice of staying, going into captivity and becoming a slave with your family for generations, or you could board one of the many, many vessels in the Phoenician Israelite fleet and take your possessions with you and sail to Africa, Europe, or the British Isles and keep your freedom. Which do you think you would do? I'd opt for freedom. Well, many Israelites had the ability to flee by sea to escape the Assyrians, and they did for decades. Spanish archaeological records confirm that many wealthy Israelites came to Spain with their wealth before Assyria defeated Israel. Ancient British and Irish records record large numbers of the tribe of Simeon and Dan, it names them by name, as arriving in Ireland and Wales about the time Samaria fell. In fact, so many Israelites wanted out, they had to establish an entirely new colony in North Africa. The Israelites called it Kiryat Hadashah. In Hebrew, this was New City. It grew wealthy, and it had inherited all of the Phoenician trade routes in the Atlantic. It possessed immense fleets of its own, and it almost destroyed Rome under its famous general called Hannibal. This is the Hannibal who marched those elephants across the Alps into Italy. Hannibal is really an Israelite name. It's a combination of the word Hananiah and Baal. As the Carthaginians worshiped Baal, the same false god that the Israelites went into idolatry in. Now, we don't know this city as Kiryat Hadashah, its original name, because it was destroyed by the Romans later. And we know it by its Roman name, which is Carthage. So we call them the Carthaginians instead of the Kiriathinians. So we know it by its Roman name as an accident of history. But Carthage's language and culture was Hebrew, although they developed later their own script. Its leaders were called the Shofetim, or judges. Its priests were called the Kohanim, or in other words, priests in Hebrew. Now there's a very strange episode in history. Hannibal was a phenomenally excellent general, and his Carthaginian army had defeated one Roman army after another in Italy. The last Roman army defending Rome had been defeated, and all Hannibal had to do to destroy Rome and take over the Roman Empire and make it part of the Carthaginian Empire was to march in and take the city. There was no one to defend it. But he just dithered and wouldn't give the order to go in and occupy the city. Well, during his dithering, another Roman army marched in to offer defense to the city, and it eventually did not fall. And historians have been absolutely mystified, wondering why Hannibal didn't just act in his own interest and take the city. I think Yahweh gave Hannibal a spirit of inaction at that time. And it was God himself who saved Rome from being conquered by an Israelite-led army of Carthaginians. Well, why would he do that? Well, remember, our Creator will always keep his prophecies and his promises. Daniel 2 records a prophecy given in the form of a dream to Nebuchadnezzar about a succession of Gentile world empires. That vision doesn't talk about all the world empires. It's a succession of Gentile world empires. The final one was to be the Roman Empire and its revival through history. You know, the Roman Empire was the iron, which is divided into two legs, just as the Roman Empire was divided into a Western and an Eastern Roman Empire. If Hannibal had taken Rome, Carthage would have ruled the Mediterranean world, and there never would have been a Roman Empire, which means Yahweh's prophecy about Rome would have failed. So God himself intervened to save Rome from an Israelite army so that Rome could grow into the empire that it was prophesied to be in Daniel 2. This is just one example of the fascinating facts about history when you look at it through the Israelite lens that you'll do when you read my books. My books do cover the entire fascinating history of Carthage, including their naval skills, their wars with Rome, their close trade relations with the Mayans in our hemisphere. After all, where do you think those Mayans learned about pyramids and human sacrifice? Well, the Carthaginians lived in North Africa. They knew about the pyramids. The human sacrifice, grisly rites were part of Baal worship, which was in Carthage, and they brought it over to the Mayans. Carthage also invented a threshing machine, which had geared wheels. The Romans preserved this information. So if you can visualize the Carthaginian engineers making even harvesting machines with geared wheels and mechanisms, this perhaps gives an insight into the knowledge which Carthage inherited from the kingdom of Israel under Solomon. Now, you may have heard of the Antikythera mechanism. There's been a number of cable TV documentaries on this. It's a very advanced geared calculating machine found off the coast of Greece. It was brought up from a shipwreck. The assumptions in those documentaries is that it was built in the Greek sphere of a region up in the area of Greece and Macedonia because it was found there. However, Greece also traded with Carthage. They were enemies for much of the time, but they had trade back and forth. Since Carthage was known to work with geared machines, maybe that Antikythera mechanism that was brought up from the bottom of the ocean by Greece was invented not by the Greeks, but within the Carthaginian Empire, and it was being brought to Greece as trade goods or as something stolen when the vessel carrying it sank. Now, Carthage, like Phoenicia, controlled Gibraltar, which was one of the gates of their enemies, a promise given to the Israelite descendants of Abraham. That promise was inherited by Carthage. They kept Greece and Rome out of the Atlantic Ocean for many centuries because for centuries, Carthage dominated Greece and Rome. Yet it was Carthaginian state policy to not allow any other nation to follow its ships to its secret colonies out in the Atlantic. However, the Greeks knew that Carthage had a monopoly on an extremely rich land somewhere out there in the Atlantic. After all, sailors will have loose lips in port, and so the Greeks learned from Carthaginian sailors, no doubt, some of the details. Well, one of the historians you probably learned about in history was Aristotle, the famous Greek historian or writer. He wrote, in the sea outside the Pillars of Hercules, which means the Gibraltar region, so he's talking about out in the Atlantic, he says, an island was found by the Carthaginians, the masters of the Western Ocean, a wilderness having navigable rivers, which was many days sailing distance away from those Pillars of Hercules. Now, another Greek writer named Diodorus, I'm not sure the pronunciation of it, wrote, there is a very great island in the vast ocean. Many days sail from Libya westward, Libya meaning a term for North Africa. The soil is very fruitful. A great part is mountainous, but much is a plain, watered with several navigable rivers. This is the secret colony that the Carthaginians had. Well, these are obviously describing North America. North America has a very mountainous region, but much of it is a central plain watered with navigable rivers, the Mississippi, the Missouri, the Ohio, and all the rest of them that empty into the Mississippi. So here in the ancient Greek records, we have a very good description of North America as being a Carthaginian colony. Now, Carthaginian coins and inscriptions have been found in Colorado, New York, Georgia, Alabama, Connecticut, Nevada, and other places. It's clear the secret Atlantic colony that gave Carthage its wealth was North America. Well, why isn't that in your history books? That's a good question, and I think the reason is that there is a God of this world who is the father of lies and does not want the truth about the 10 tribes of Israel known to the modern world. He wants their identity kept hidden and secret, not only from them, but all other nations, because if the world knew this history, they would know that there is a living creator who authored the Bible and who keeps his promises and has been doing so all along. It would also open our eyes as to what's happening in prophecy in our world right before us right now. But it's known from secular history that Carthage had many exploration fleets they sent out into the Atlantic, and colonization ones too. One was led by an admiral named Hanno. In my book, I have the evidence that Dr. Barry Fell found a Carthaginian inscription on the American East Coast saying, by this, Hanno takes possession, so, showing the very Carthaginian inscription that dates to that time. Now, the Phoenician and Carthaginian ships were immense. They were far, far bigger than the teeny-weeny little ships that Columbus and the European explorers of his time sailed when they rediscovered North America. The Greeks record the Carthaginians once sent into the Atlantic a fleet filled with 10,000 men and women as colonists. This is also documented in my books. And when you divide the number of 10,000 by the number of ships that are mentioned, you can see they've got hundreds of colonists on each ship. Now, modern man assumes that ancient man didn't know the world was around. In fact, it was Greece and Rome which were so backward about world geography because the Phoenicians and Carthaginians kept them bottled up in the Mediterranean and refused to allow Greece and Rome access to the rest of the world. Carthage and Israel and Phoenicia, they all knew the world was around because their fleets sailed everywhere. To keep their sailing routes secret, the Carthaginian Senate passed a law that any Carthaginian ship that was being followed or spied upon could run the ship aground, if necessary, and lose its cargo, and its owners would be reimbursed by the Carthaginian government to make sure that no Greek or Roman ship could discover the secret sea routes across the Atlantic. Now, Carthage is regarded as the richest city of the ancient world. The monopoly they had on the wealth came from the New World, which they took all of North America's wealth. Now, in the Bible, we see evidence that the people from the Hebrew tradition of the Israelites, Phoenicians, and Carthaginians knew the world was round. Look at Job 26:7. It says there, God hung the earth upon nothing. So, in the time of Job, it was understood that the earth was just hanging there as a ball or a sphere in the ether of space. Isaiah 40, verse 22 states, God sits upon the circle of the earth. So they understood the world was circular, a sphere. Also, you've probably seen in ancient maps all these maps of oceans and seas where they have all kinds of sea monsters to scare people. Well, this was part of an ancient Carthaginian disinformation campaign. The Carthaginians spread all these rumors about terrible, horrible monsters out there in the sea to keep the Greeks and Romans too scared to sail on the oceans. if the Carthaginians knew that even today, modern man thinks that the ancient world didn't know the world was round, they would roll in their graves laughing, because it was basically everyone knew the world was round except for the backward Greeks and Romans who didn't know this because their ships were not allowed out on the oceans, because God had kept his promises that the Israelite empires would have the gates of their enemies, which included Gibraltar. Well, Carthage finally fell due to the sins and excesses of Baalism, just as Israel did in biblical times. And my book offers a plausible account of where they went to, its survivors, when it fell. But now let's move on to the second empire of Israel that was founded by the exiles, and that's the Israelite power of Scythia. Remember, Genesis 21:12 had a critical clue for locating the birthright descendants of Abraham in the future. That was the Israelites. It said, "In Isaac shall your seed be called." So in history, we can always locate birthright descendants, which are primarily Ephraim and Manasseh, because Yahweh says they will bear the name of Isaac upon them. And we saw that Amos 7:16 showed that was already true by the time they left the Promised Land. Assyrian records included. And when the Israelites left the Promised Land, most of them neither went into captivity nor fled via ship. The Israelites were far too numerous to fit their entire nation into the ships that were fleeing to the colonies. Most of them had to flee overland, abandoning the Promised Land, and these are the ones that migrated to the Caucasus Mountain Black Sea region. These are the ones that Jeremiah 3 was addressed to when God said, give this message to Israel, send it to the north, Jeremiah. You come right to the Black Sea region when you draw a line north of Jerusalem. In 1875, Colonel Gawler, who was an official of the British government of Queen Victoria, wrote a piece that the classical sources placed the fleeing Israelites north of Armenia in the Black Sea. They became known as the Scythians, or the Sacae, S-A-C-A-E. A-E is a plural suffix, but S-A-C is the sac, that's the word Isaac, preserved for us in the English form. Now, the Persian term was Saka, S-A-K-A, which is more like the Itzhak, which is more like the Hebraic form. There's another Hebrew kingdom that was founded and named in the Caucasus Mountains when the Israelites got there. It was called Iberia, which was based on the name Eber, just like the Israelite name for ancient Spain. So there was a West Iberia and an East Iberia. One was Spain, one was up in the Caucasus Mountains. The Bible has two scriptures supporting the secular sources which record that many Israelites migrated to the Black Sea. 2 Kings 19:37 is one of them, where Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, was assassinated by his sons, and this was soon after the kingdom of Israel fell. They fled to a land where they knew the people would be intensely anti-Assyrian and would shelter them from the Assyrians who were trying to find them. Well, the Bible says they fled to Armenia, up in the Caucasus. They did so because they knew that's where they'd find Israelites, the bitter enemies of the Assyrians, and that they would count on them for shelter. Now, Jeremiah 3:12's message, that Yahweh would send that message via Jeremiah, again, reinforces this. That's the second part, where it shows they were up in the Black Sea region. So we see that God keeps his promises to Abraham's descendants, and they especially would become many nations with large populations, that those birthright tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh, would be known by the name of Isaac. That was in Genesis 48's blessing ceremony, where you can see that. Now, remember that Yahweh had good words for Israel in Jeremiah 3. He said backsliding Israel has justified herself at that point. So there clearly had to be some revival among these Israelites that went north to the Black Sea. The Greek writer Herodotus recorded that these Israelites by the Black Sea, who were named after Isaac, the Sacae, forbid idols in their land, and they also refused to keep swine. Now, these are prominent aspects of Torah, which you would expect to see only among the tribes of Israel, a commandment against idolatry and a commandment against keeping or eating swine. Now, the Scythians are mentioned in Colossians 3:11, where Paul lists them as being the opposite, or barbarians. So these Scythians were clearly not considered to be a barbarous people. Now, the Scythians, or Sacae, renamed the rivers flowing into the Black Sea. They named all of them after the tribe of Dan, which had a habit of naming places after their forefather Dan. Before the Israelites got there, these rivers all had Greek names. But after the Israelites got there, these rivers were given names after the tribe of Dan, and they're all on the maps today. It's the Danube, the Don, or the Dniester, and the Dnieper. These are other rivers in Russia. The Danube, of course, flows out of Europe. Now, in about 624 BC, a century after Samaria fell, these Scythian Israelites from the north invaded the Assyrian Empire with their allies, and they crushed Assyria for good. So we tend to get the impression that Assyria was all powerful, and the Israelites, were fleeing from them as they go out of the Promised Land. And it was true at that point. But not all that long later, it was Israel who had the last laugh, and they completely came down and invaded and destroyed the Assyrian Empire. These invading Israelites also came into Palestine and reoccupied the old Promised Land. They went as far as Egypt, and Egypt paid tribute money to avoid an invasion. So while the Scythians destroyed the Assyrian Empire and their troops filled up Mesopotamia and the Promised Land and Turkey and Syria and Lebanon on a modern map, they were protective of the Jews. They still realized the Jews who were still living in Judah were their brother tribe. Now, the Scythians reoccupied the Israelite homelands during the reign of King Josiah of Judah. Greek histories call them the Scythians, or the Sacae, who had come into that region. But the Bible, which of course is written from a Hebraic point of view, refers to them by their Hebrew names. 2 Chronicles 34:9 and 35:18 refer to these Scythians as Manasseh, Ephraim, the remnant of Israel that was present. These were the Israelite tribes who had come down from the Black Sea region into their old homelands when they reconquered them. So at the very exact time that the Greeks say the Scythians were in the old Promised Land, the Bible says the 10 tribes had returned. Now, some say the mention of Israelites being in their tribal territories in Josiah's time is a conflict with the Bible's own statement that all the tribes were removed from the land when Samaria fell. Well, no way. This actually confirms that the Scythian Sacae were the tribes of Israel, which for a brief time had come back in the time of King Josiah. But they only stayed in that region for a couple of decades, and then they pulled all their troops out of Mesopotamia and Israel, Syria, Turkey, Lebanon, etc., and they all went back to the Black Sea region. Scythia was one of the largest empires of all time, from about 624 to 605 BC. It's hardly ever mentioned in the history books, and the reason is because they just simply chose to go back home. They didn't want to rule all these people down there, and they just were isolationists and went back home. If the truth about Scythia was told, their Israelite origin and the truth of the Bible would become obvious. Well, why did the Scythians just go back to the Black Sea region? Why didn't they stay? I think it's because the Israelites who invaded Palestine, or the Promised Land, as Scythians, they were the grandchildren of the Israelites who had fled from the Assyrians. They had heard that that old Promised Land was a land of milk and honey. But when they got there, they found it was a land of weeds and foreigners, and that it was way too small for their huge populations. I think they just decided it simply wasn't worth the bother, and they returned to Scythia. I mean, Judah has an attachment to the land there that the Israelites, or 10 tribes, simply didn't have. Later generations of Israelites didn't care to go back there the way Judah always just wanted to return. Now, the empires of Babylon and Persia then grew up in the power vacuum when Scythia left Mesopotamia. Now, Scythia fought 2 gigantic wars with the Persian Empire, and you'll hardly read anything about them, except in my books, even though the Greeks recorded many details about these wars. So when you go to the classical history, there's a lot written about them. But it's always the Israelite empires that are the ones deleted from the history books. Isn't that an interesting omission? The first war that the Scythians had with Persia was in 528 BC, when Cyrus the Great, who I'm sure you've have heard about and read about, he invaded the Scythians who were at that time living east of the Caspian Sea. So these are not people by the Black Sea. These are the Scythians that were by the Caspian Sea and east of it. This is more like in what we'd call Afghanistan, or almost to the region of western China. This was in the area where archaeologists have found mummies of Caucasian or European mummies with blonde and red hair. National Geographic magazine did a documentary on them, and you may have seen the cable TV documentary, The Riddle of the Desert Mummies. These were the evidence of the Scythians, or Israelites, who once lived in that region. These are the people Cyrus the Great attacked. The major Israelite or Sacae tribe that he attacked was called the Massa Gittai, the tribe of Manasseh. Now, the Sake sought a peaceful solution, but the Persians insisted on war. The Greeks wrote that the entire Persian army was slaughtered, and Cyrus the Great himself was killed. My book has a lot of interesting details about it, but I don't have time in the message today to give you a lot. But in my book, you'll see the evidence that these Scythians were the descendants of the tribes of Israel who had gone into an Assyrian domination. When Assyria fell apart, these Israelite tribes were free to migrate, and they left up into the region east of the Caspian Sea. So they were really liberated by their brother Israelite tribes from the Black Sea. Now, when Persia decided to invade them, these Scythian Israelites were in no mood to go back into captivity to anyone. The Scythians were led by a very tough-minded queen named Thamyris, or Tamar, in Greek accounts. The consonants TMR are the same as Tamar, the name of one of King David's daughters. Now remember that God's covenant with David included the promise that his descendants would rule over the 10 tribes of Israel. Well, these Scythians were part of the 10 tribes. And here they had a queen ruling over them, which had the same name as King David's daughter. So this is from the seed of David ruling over them, just as prophecy had said it would. Well, usually they had kings, but at that time it was a queen. And she was the ancient equivalent of Maggie Thatcher, a real iron lady of her own. She led her people in a great war against the Persians and obliterated them. When she lost her son in the war, and when the war was over, she found the body of Cyrus the Great, had his head cut off, and she poured molten gold into it to give him the gold that he had come to conquer. So when you read about Cyrus the Great and the great Persian Empire in ancient history, realize that those history books aren't telling you the whole story. That Cyrus the Great was great, but the Scythians were greater. They beat the you-know-what off the Persians, but you don't hear about the Scythians in the textbooks. Now, these eastern Scythians by the Caspian Sea were sun worshippers. They were sun worshippers when they went into captivity, Baal worshippers, and they did not experience that revival that Jeremiah 3 said the Black Sea Scythians had experienced. Now, the Second Great War occurred in about 512 BC when King Darius of Persia attacked the Scythians by the Black Sea. And he marched an army of 700,000 troops through the Balkan Europe region, that's, the old area of Yugoslavia, and he attacked the Black Sea Scythians from the European angle. Given what I have written in my book about where the tribes of Israel are in the world today, I'm sure some of your ancestors fought in these wars. The Persians lost 70,000 men, and the rest barely escaped back to Persia. In one short campaign, the Persians lost as many men as the United States lost in Vietnam in 15 years. Now, the Scythians that they attacked, these were the Black Sea Scythians who forbid idolatry and refused pork. This war was fought north of the Black Sea in the modern region of, say, Ukraine, Crimea, southern Russia. Two more things I'll mention about the Scythians before closing on them is that a clump of arrows was the Scythian war sign, and the eagle was one of their national symbols. Can you think of a modern nation that has an eagle crest as its national symbol, where that eagle is holding a clump of arrows as its war sign? Well, hopefully on the screen you're seeing a heraldry image of the Great Seal of the United States, which shows an eagle holding a clump of arrows, the ancient war sign of the Scythians. So it's amazing how some of these aspects of Israelite or ancient heraldry will persist over the centuries. So while Parthia was rising to power in Asia, Carthage was being defeated by the Romans in the Punic Wars. However, Scythia lasted for centuries alongside of Parthia, and they were allied kingdoms fighting often against the Greeks or the Romans. Parthia would get in wars against these foreign powers, and then the Scythians would come and send their troops to rescue Parthia and reinforce them in the battle. They were like brother kingdoms, just exactly the way the United States and the British Empire were in World War I and World War II, where the British would get in trouble fighting against the Germans and their allies, and the United States would come and reinforce the British troops and support them, and then go home afterwards. So Scythia and Parthia were fellow tribesmen of Israel. They had the same language, same customs. They were natural allies. Now I'll get to my closing. In ending my discussion of Carthage and Scythia, one final point is worth repeating. I really want to emphasize this. You hear a lot about the empires of Assyria, Babylon, and Persia, and Rome, and Greece in history texts. But ask yourself this question. Why don't you hear more about Carthage, which almost destroyed Rome and dominated Rome for centuries? Why don't you hear a whole lot more about the Sacae Scythians, who destroyed the Assyrian Empire and twice crushed the Persian Empire in warfare, even killing Cyrus the Great, who died among his troops much like Custer died among his troops? Well, the reason is that Carthage and Scythia were Israelite empires, and as I mentioned earlier, there is a God of this world who in this age is still hiding and obscuring the truth of the Bible. But if you read my books, you will see the entire history of the Israelite tribes throughout their history brought to light, and it'll greatly reinforce your faith in the Bible and where we are in the world today. If the truth about Israel's tribes throughout history and where they are today were known, it would turn the world upside down. But Satan is the father of lies. Jesus Christ himself said so in John 8:44, and he had not yet been bound. So these lies are still dominating the world's perception of itself, and the biblical truths are not known. But there's no reason why any of you in this audience should be deceived about this history anymore. Well, you can learn the truth about what really happened to the migrating 10 tribes of Israel in my books. Mike Bacon has several sets of my books there for sale. To read the entire history of the tribes of Israel, you need the entire 4-book set. And if the case of books that is there gets sold out, you can order more at the same price online by going to my website, which is www.stephenmcollins.com. Just click on the books option at the homepage, and it will send you to the publisher's live links for it. Or you can send $80 for the set that includes all the shipping fees to Stephen Collins, P.O. Box 88735, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, 57109-8735. That's if you want all 4 books. The price for 1 book is $25. So there's a discount if you order the 4-book set. Now, also at my website, you'll find many of my articles and research papers available for free, that photo gallery of the ancient Hebrew inscriptions in New Mexico. I have audio messages there that go into greater detail on subjects. There's now hundreds of blogs I've written over the last couple of years, which offer many updates on not just the history of the 10 tribes of Israel, but is closely following what's happening in the modern world and discussing the prophecies about the 10 tribes of Israel in light of today's headlines. I urge you to share my website with others you know who have an interest in biblical history and prophecy and would also like to build their faith in Yahweh or God's Word. And the prophecy blogs are especially making the site very current, as there's a lot happening in the world today as we draw deeper into the latter days. Well, I'll just close with a teaser on my second message, which is coming up on the last great day. How many will God save? I think the answer has been there in the Bible all along, but believers haven't seen it. And one reason is in the King James Version, there are some translational oddities that have obscured it. But I just want to give you that teaser for the second message. With that, I'll conclude and be happy to take questions. So, Mike, I'll turn it over to you to direct it on that end.
Yes. My mother was a Moreno, and I understand that that's a Jewish name. I don't know if you know or if you can help me on that. Also, my wife's great-grandmother was a Yutzi, and she...
I hate to interrupt, but I'm just getting garbled sounds. I'm not able to understand the question.
Okay, we'll try it this way.
Okay, my
Get up to here.
My mother was a Moreno, Moreno, and I understand that's a Jewish name. I don't know if you can help me on that, but my wife, her great-grandmother was a Yutzi who came from Spain, and she was very wealthy, or there was a lot of wealth in Spain, and Grandma Yutzi said my wife could claim that. Do you know if Yutzi is a Hebrew name?
Well, now, when you say the Utes, are you referring to the Native American Ute tribe, from which we get the term Utah?
No, Yutzi, Y-U-T-Z-E, was Grandma. That was Grandma's name, Yutzi, Y-U-T-Z-E.
A lot of letters are similar. This is this is not something I would cover in my book, but when you have the word, the way you pronounce it, Yutzi, it sounds very much like the term Utes or Jutes that were part of the Anglo-Saxons, and Jutes or Utes. Jutland, the peninsula of Denmark, is named Jutland or Jutland. Phonetically it's very similar, and that could be. There is the Judah term Yehuda, and so it's very possible it has an Israelite origin. I couldn't possibly respond to any individual's Israelite background origin just over the phone. It's way too complex. But phonetically, it's certainly similar to the tribes of the Israelites who went with the Anglos and Saxons, the Jutes that went in there, or Yehuda. I will mention that in my book, you mentioned the Marranos, I believe. That's a Spanish people that were over here in the New World. Many of these people fled over to the New World via Mexico, and also dwelled in the American Southwest. The language of the Uto-Aztecan people has many Hebrew vowel sounds and language similarities in the phonetics of it that a scholar in language has done a study on, and that's in one of my books. But I wouldn't be able to give you more details other than that information is in my book, showing the Hebrew roots of that language into the American Southwest. And that's also supported by the fact that, as I mentioned in my message today, that the Ten Commandments in ancient Hebrew of the Paleo-Hebrew period of about 1000 BC is written on that giant slab by Los Lunas, New Mexico, and also in other locations in the American Southwest. I've seen more than that, where I went with a Hebrew scholar who showed me where some of the ones are located in New Mexico. It's as near as up by Albuquerque. And so the Israelites were present in that area throughout the Phoenician and Carthaginian periods. With that, let's move on to the next question.
Tell him I'll email him later.
Yes, I live on the island of Molokai, and over in the Hawaiian Islands, and some of the native Hawaiians there have told me that they believe that they are descendants from some of the Israelites, and I was wondering if you could comment on that. One of the claims they make is they learned some of the great sea navigational skills from that ancestrage.
Okay, well, in fact, I do have something in my book there where I point out that during the reign of King Solomon, the Israelite fleets that were taught the secrets of the sea by the Phoenician sailors when they merged their ships and fleets and their crews, that Solomon's fleet sailed all over the world, including there's evidence in the Hawaiian Islands and in Polynesia. There has been evidence sent to me of Phoenician ports that have been found in the region of Australasia. And remember, the Bible says that Solomon had a great fleet of ships that returned only every third year to Israel, loaded with, it says, apes and peacocks and, their life forms from other continents. So it's clearly evident that these ships were sailing to other continents in the world and coming back to Israel. And I do believe that the Israelites were in Hawaii, and that the people who gave you that information from their ancestral records are correct. That the Israelites were in ancient Hawaii. They were all over the Pacific and Atlantic and Indian Oceans. They had ports that went out into the Atlantic via the colonies that way, but they also had Etzion Gabar on the Red Sea that would empty, you could sail out into the Indian Ocean and from there out into the Pacific. So I have no doubt that the Phoenicians were exploring the entire world at that time. And remember, Solomon had an absolutely voracious appetite for knowledge. God had given him so much wisdom. And my books talk about how he wanted to catalog every form of life that was on earth, from the greatest cedars of Lebanon to the hyssop that grew on the wall. I mean, he had botany charts, and he wanted animals from all continents. Can you imagine the zoos that must have been, and the gardens that must have been in Jerusalem in the time of King Solomon, when his fleets were bringing back samples of animals and plants from all over the world? And so, to answer your question, yes, I can believe that the Israelites were in Hawaii, and I hadn't heard of those verbal legends in the past, but I would agree with them. And also the North American Indian traditions, of which I discuss in my books as well, also relate that their ancestors came from the east across the ocean, and include records of many contacts with people from the east, which had come across the Atlantic. So the oral traditions of many native peoples are actually full of embedded truths. Next question.
Do you have any, I have two questions. The first one is, do you have any idea what year we are in now? You seem to understand chronology. If you count back from creation forward, what would be our current year? And the second question is this: do you see any significance one way or the other to the United States having a president named Barack Obama?
To answer your last question first, people at my website, I haven't put it on my website, but people have sent me indications that there is a scripture in the Bible that can be translated phonetically as something close to Barack Obama, indicating that he may be fulfilling a prophecy about the dark side in the latter days. We'll have to see on that. That's too premature to know. So all I can say is I have heard of some people that are teaching that. I myself do not know yet. But the first part of your question on, boy, that opens up a gigantic issue as to when you say from creation. Because Genesis 1:1 says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And then it says the earth became tohu and bohu, without form and void. But when we see creation week starting, with the creation of the modern species and Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, that's not the beginning of creation. Creation week starts with the earth already here. It says the Spirit of God moved on the face of the deep. That's the oceans. So the oceans were already here, and it was dark, the atmosphere. We're seeing a destroyed earth, but an earth that is here nonetheless, and that God is reforming and recreating a beautiful earth in Genesis week. So I think we are approximately about 6,000 years from the creation of Adam and Eve in the Genesis week account, which I believe was a literal 7-day week with 6 days of creative work and then the 7th day Sabbath rest, which God instituted at the end of that creation week. However, we don't know how long the earth was in existence before creation week. I have an article at my website, I believe it's called, Is the Earth 6,000 Years Old? And you can read through that, and it discusses a great deal about the prehistory of the earth, the angelic period on the earth, Lucifer's rebellion, what the earth was like before Adam and Eve were created, how the destruction occurred, etc. So there really isn't a conflict between science and the Bible. It doesn't matter if the earth is millions or billions of years old. We don't know how long the angelic period was before Lucifer fell and became Satan. It says he was perfect in the day he was created. So I'm sure that God did not, built-in obsolescence, like some cars might have today. It took a long time for Lucifer to go bad and become Satan. And my article at the website will discuss some of those issues because it's beyond the scope of the discussion today. But I think we are approximately 6,000 years, which would, based on 1,000 years equal a day, indicate that we're nearing a 7th 1,000-year period, which will be the Messianic age, or millennium, that will last for 1,000 years. I don't know how close we are to that. And Archbishop Usher estimated that the Adam and Eve were created in 4004 BC. But we don't know if he was exactly correct. He has a ballpark figure. Also, we don't know when that 6,000-year period began that pictures mankind's period of labor under sin before it has 1,000 years of Sabbath rest in the Messianic age. Adam and Eve, when they were created, they were sinless. We don't know how long. I think the book of Jubilees says it was 7 or 8 years. If I remember right, other sources speculate longer. But I don't think that really that 6,000-year clock started until Adam and Eve actually sinned. So however long they lived in the garden sinless, that would move time backward a bit. Or even if Adam and Eve were created in 4004, the 6,000-year period of labor under sin didn't start until they later sinned. And then 6,000 years of clock is running down until we get to the beginning of the Messianic age. I hope that answers your questions, and I'll defer to my website for an in-depth article on that other part of the question. Next question.
Okay. Psalm 83 you'd mentioned is a past war. What we'd like to, there's some theories thinking that this is also a prophecy of something coming in the future. Is it possible that this could pertain to both?
Well, that question comes up periodically at my website, and I answer it when readers ask that. I'm a stickler for getting the scriptures in context. For example, we have many prophecies where it says specifically for the latter days or the day of the Lord, in the time of the end. When you see language like that, you know that it's for the latter day context. Now, when you look at Psalm 83, I don't see any language in there that indicates that it's for the latter days. Theoretically, one could say it's possible, but when you look at the context, many of David's Psalms were written about the activities and events of his life. When he's crying out for healing, or when he's being forsaken by everyone in the rebellion of Absalom, or when he's praising God for the victories that he's been given over his enemies. He writes many things out of the events of his life in his Psalms. And Psalm 83 fits so perfectly that First Chronicles account of the war that Asher and the Mesopotamians and all their vassals, which were many of the Assyrian Empire, fought against Israel to try to wipe them out. Psalm 83 says Asher is with them toward the end of that listing of nations, and those nations would have been people who were allied to Assyria or that were their vassals at that time. Really, all the Syrians or Aramaeans became David's vassals in that particular war, and one of them was even his ally going into it, the Bible says. So David had his allies too in that war. But my own personal view is that is not prophetic for the latter days, because it does not have any language in it that indicates that it has a latter day perspective. And I think it's writing about David's proclamation of glorifying God, about his victory over all these nations that had tried to defeat Israel, and that they had all come to help the children of Lot, which that whole war started with a rebellion by the Ammonites, who were the children of Lot. Remember, that was the example where David's ambassadors had their beards cut off on one side of their face, I think, to mock them. And that was the provocation, whereby all these other nations came in to help Ammon, because David's army was being set up for a conflict that was much bigger than they expected. Next question.
Yes, hi. I am remarried. I have a son from a previous marriage, and I'm just curious about the surnames of all my sons. One is Daniels, and I am married now to Benson. And so I'm just curious about the origin of those surnames. I mean, they kind of seem self-evident, but I'm just curious. I know Benjamin is part of Judah back in the land, but are there not Benjamites that might possibly be still out there in the diaspora? And does Benson suggest the name Benjamin? I don't know, and the same with Dan. That's my question.
Okay, again, I'm always reluctant to try to identify anybody's tribal legacy by virtue of names, because, as you know, the Bible reckons tribal lineages patrilineally through the father. In Jewish tradition today, they recognize a matrilineal through the mother calculation of the tribes. You are correct that Benjamin used to be closely linked to the house of Judah. However, that was not going to be permanent. After the diaspora of the Israelites and then the exile of the Jews from the Promised Land, when Titus and the Romans expelled the Jews from the region of Jerusalem and the Promised Land, Benjamin had to go its own way, because in Genesis 49, Benjamin has a separate tribal prophecy about them that is different and distinct from Judah. So they're no longer together in the end times. It's Levi and Simeon that are prophesied to be scattered among the other tribes in the latter days in Genesis 49. But Benjamin is given a distinct identity of its own. They're to raven as a wolf, and wolves are typically in northern climates. They would have to be a small nation, because Benjamin became the smallest tribe of Israel after that terrible war in Judges. And so my book identifies Benjamin as the Norwegians, the tribe that is in the north that used to raven as a wolf pack. The Vikings would prey on all the other tribes and fight all the other tribes in their Viking wolf packs, even as Benjamin foolishly fought all the other tribes at once in the book of Judges. That's just one background. Daniel, of course, is a biblical name, and without knowing anybody's detailed genealogical history, and I'm not a genealogist, it has long been the custom to give names to people out of the Bible, as long as Christian traditions have been there. This goes back clear into Europe. So we don't know if this goes clear back to biblical times or if somebody adopted a name out of the Bible during the Christian period of Europe and brought it over to North America, or what time they came. Benson could fit Benjamin because, as you very likely know, the Nordic tribes, S-O-N or S-E-N, Johnson, Swenson, Olson, Benson, all of these things are indicators of a Nordic origin from Norway, Sweden, Denmark, etc., where everyone was named the son of so-and-so. Like if your father's name was Lars, you'd be named Larson. Or if he was Ole, you were Olson. And somewhere back in the background in the surname you gave me of Benson, there was a Ben. And so they became Ben's sons and were known as Bensons from then on. But Ben is the first syllable of Benjamin, so it's very possible that could be an origin. Daniel, of course, the tribe of Dan, named many geographical features after itself. In the Bible, they did it when Dan went with the Scythians up into the Black Sea. All the rivers were renamed after the tribe of Dan. So Dan, very typically, that name of Dan follows the tribe of Dan as well. So I can't say for sure, but that's really all I can comment because I have very little to go on. And please accept these comments as speculative. These are just looking for possibilities. Next question.
We're from the foothills of Northern California, where recent discoveries have found in the mines, in the gold mines and the silver mines, just above Stockton, Sacramento, the ancient writings on the wall, which were originally thought to be American Indian, are now deciphered to be Carthaginian, Phoenician, and ancient Hebrew. A book written recently, California, BC, has a lot of information on this. I'm just wondering if you had any more information about that area from the travels of our ancient ancestors.
Well, that's a very interesting point you bring up. I have not heard of that book. In fact, if at my website, I would encourage you to hit the contact me button and give me the information on that book and who the author is. As I'd love to get a copy of that and let others know about it as well. That doesn't surprise me because the Carthaginians and the Phoenicians, as I pointed out in my message, used North America as a source for minerals, not just copper up by the Great Lakes region, but gold, silver, mica, iron ore down in Brazil. They searched for ores wherever they could find them. And so it makes sense that if there was ore here to find, they would look for it and exploit it. And they traveled very widely. The Israelites were clearly in the American Southwest, so California isn't much further. And the fleets of Solomon could easily have gone out into the Indian and Pacific Ocean. As the earlier questioner asked about Hawaii, they could have continued on to the west coast of America. It's very clear that the Chinese did so because Chinese anchor stones have been found in Californian ports, clearly showing that the Chinese had explored the western parts of the United States, at least our coastlands, during their heyday, which would have been more like the medieval period in Europe. But that's a fascinating piece of information you have because periodically I do get accounts of Phoenician and Carthaginian inscriptions and artifacts surfacing in various places around what is America today, being found in ancient context. So I think what you mentioned is very believable. It doesn't surprise me, but I have not heard of that particular account you gave. I'd love to have you convey that information to me, and I'll let others know about it too, because that's very interesting to know. As more and more information is being found confirming that the Phoenicians and Carthaginians, who were Israelites, were over here, but this information is always suppressed. We were always, I assume most of you were also raised in school with, Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, etc. And there's been a just phobia about the educational elites not wanting to believe that the old world civilizations were over here long, long, long before Columbus. Columbus, in fact, rediscovered America after the Dark Ages, when so much knowledge was lost that previously used to exist among the world's civilizations that had global and world trade. And the whole world was linked in global trade under David and Solomon with the Phoenician fleets and later with the Carthaginian fleets, because they were a commercial maritime empire and grew wealthy off of world and global trade. So what you mentioned in California just further supports what's in my book, Israel's Lost Empires, where it discusses these ancient trade fleets of the Israelites going around the world, and then later the Carthaginians. So thank you very much for bringing that to my attention. I'm looking forward to seeing that book, and please pass that information on to me at my website, who the author is, so I can publicize it. Next question.
Shalom Aleichem in Yeshua's name, my friend. An opinion only. Do you believe that it is important that we identify with our tribes that supposedly the Hebrew names will be written on their foreheads of the 12 tribes of Israel from the 144,000? Or do you think that the Messiah will separate us onto the gates within the heavenly realms?
Okay. I think I'm online for that. I'm turning also in my Bible to Revelation 7 for that part about the 144,000, as there's a question that almost comes up every time, so I'm just going to anticipate it and answer it because it fits right in with what you mentioned there. I personally think that Yeshua the Savior will separate the tribes according to his knowledge as to where everyone is. Because unlike the Jews, who have been very rigorous in preserving their genealogies, the 10 tribes of Israel have not. I mean, they don't even remember that they are Israelite, much less having genealogies as to which tribe. And they've intermarried so much over the centuries that only the Creator himself, who reckons things patrilineally, would know which tribe everyone specifically belongs to. You can get a general, odds-on favorite as to which tribe you're in by reading my book, Israel's Tribes Today, where it goes through the clues of Genesis 49, identifying which modern nations are which tribes of Israel. But of course, there's pockets in the United States. We're such a huge nation that although we began as Manasseh, there's so many of other tribes that have moved in here as well. And so it's not possible to say that someone is a Manassite because they're an American, or they're an Ephraimite because they're British, etc. It's much more complex and individual than that. And so we're only speaking of the general tribe that's dominant in particular modern nations in my books. By no means do I imply that everybody living in the borders of certain modern nations are parts of that tribe. So I do think that this is, when it says that they're sealed in their foreheads, in Revelation 7, this 144,000, the forehead, I think, is just the mind, where your seat of consciousness is. And you'll be sealed there with the Ruach, or the Holy Spirit, and that's something that the Creator would understand, and he will be the ones who are dividing which tribe's which. But the question always comes up, or usually does, in Revelation 7, how come the tribe of Dan isn't mentioned in that listing of the 144,000? So I'll just go ahead and answer that briefly. I think that there's a scribal error here. Because when you read in verse 4, the introduction to this listing states, and I heard the number of them which were sealed, and there were sealed 144,000, notice this, of all the tribes of the children of Israel. So the intent was here to list all the tribes of Israel. Now, the math, of course, only works out if you list 12. You won't get 144,000 with 13 tribes times 12,000, and I think an ancient scribe got confused as to which names to list, because when you have Manasseh and Ephraim jointly composing Joseph, you end up with 13 tribes. And if you'll notice in verse 6, Manasseh is mentioned, but in verse 8, Joseph is mentioned. So actually Manasseh, which was half of Joseph, got mentioned twice, and Dan didn't get listed. and since verse 4 says all the tribes were to be listed, I think somewhere in some distant century long ago, a scribe got confused, and he knew that he had to leave one name out and to come up with the math right. So he inadvertently didn't realize that Manasseh was part of Joseph, and so he mentioned Manasseh twice, once directly and once indirectly, and he just left out Dan. But I think verse 4 makes it clear all the tribes are supposed to be mentioned here. So I think that was a scribal error that goes way back to a distant time that we can't possibly imagine how far back it goes. But if we take verse 4 literally, Dan should have been in the list. So, next question.
Steve, I'm going to just interject something here real quick for everyone as an announcement, so just bear with us just a second. Okay, because we're going over and some people are leaving, I wanted you all to know that the field day does start today at 1:30. There's going to be organized games and contests with prizes at the soccer field. That's at the soccer field at 1:30 start today. And Drury has asked that those who volunteered to help out with the field day, please meet with Drury at the piano up here at the front of the room here after this meeting, directly after the meeting, and he says thank you very much. So now with that, we'll go back to this next question.
Hi there. There are a lot of preachers starting to preach that there's going to be an Islamic Antichrist, and they're saying that the king of Syria is one of the candidates for that, and yet one of the Antichrist is supposed to be Assyrian. Are they getting Syria and Assyria mixed up?
Well, to answer your question, I think they may be getting Syria and Assyria mixed up. There is an Assyrian Christian church that was based in Iraq. They had that name really because that's the old historical region of Assyria, although I think the real Assyrians moved out and joined the Israelites when they migrated into Europe later on. But I personally don't hold to the idea that the biblical Antichrist that's prophesied about in the book of Revelation, or called the man of sin, etc., is going to be an Islamic person. I think that's going to be a pseudo-Christian or someone pretending to be Christian or someone who appeals to Christians somehow. There certainly could be false messiahs in any number of different religions emerging, because Matthew 24 says there will be false Christs, plural, false anointed ones, false messiahs. The president of Iran believes that there's going to be a Shiite Messiah, the 12th or hidden Imam, which he expects to come in a great conflagration here at the end of the age. So a number of religions have expectations about a Messiah to come, but in our Christian tradition or believer tradition, we expect Yeshua, Jesus Christ, to be the Messiah and Savior. And just categorically, the biblical evidence indicates that the God who wrote the Bible is the one who is the creator and who's controlling world events, so that's who the Savior is going to be. But keep in mind, we were warned in Matthew 24 that at the very end time, deceptions would be very great. And it also warns that if it were possible, it would deceive the very elect. I don't have that verse in front of me in Matthew 24, but I'm sure you'll find that. The very elect are people that are believers in Yeshua or Jesus Christ as Savior. An Islamic Antichrist isn't going to confuse them for one moment or even risk deceiving them. It has to be someone that is appealing to Christian believers to have any chance at all of deceiving the very elect. So I think that the biblical prophecies about an Antichrist have to mean an Antichrist that will emerge from somewhere within the Christian traditions or nations that will do false miracles and signs and proclaim himself to be Christ incarnate or something like that, whatever title he gives to himself, that'll be the Antichrist. I'll cut my answer short because I know you've got activities to go on, and so there probably isn't a lot of time for more question and answer. So if there's another question, let's go to the next one.
In light of going back to tribal identity, I just wanted to know what your thoughts were on DNA testing.
Okay, what my thoughts are on DNA testing. I want to confess right at the start, I'm not a geneticist. different people send me links and so forth about haplotypes and what DNA proves and so forth. Frankly, I'm reluctant to get into that because I am not skilled in that topic. I'm not a geneticist or a researcher on that. So I personally don't put a great deal of stock in those evidences because I'm not skilled in the discussion of it to be a qualified judge of that. I look at things much more like linguistic, geographic, historical evidence, biblical prophecies that are applied to the secular record, and those are the things I follow in trying to determine where the Israelites are. Now, there may be good evidence in the DNA arguments. I'm not saying that there isn't, but I'm not a qualified person to really pass judgment on those because I just have not studied that field. I will say, just in the broadest general respect, that all of us descended from Noah's family. So there was just 8 people that got off that ark. And all of us have to have a great deal of genetics in common. And secular history, the geneticists have concluded that they're surprised at how common the DNA code is for all mankind. There is a TV documentary called Super Volcanoes, which I urge you watch if it ever comes up again on cable TV. Because on it, you see the scientists saying that the human race almost died out at one point. And they say that, I think if I remember right from the program, that it only had to be 1,000 or 2 human beings left on the earth for the DNA to be so common in the world today. And in fact, the Bible confirms that, but it says it was 8 people on the ark when the human race almost died out. And that's why we have such common DNA, is because we all came from one nuclear family. The sons, obviously, of Noah and his wife all came from the same genetic pool, so it was the wives of Shem, Ham, and Japheth that brought the genetic diversity into the human race that resulted in the modern races and ethnic groups that we have. But it was clearly God's will for all of these races and ethnic groups to exist, or he wouldn't have brought those wives to Shem, Ham, and Japheth to make sure they got on the ark. So that's really all I can answer on the DNA field, since I'm not an expert in that field. Next question.
Yes, I have a question in regards to 2 specific people groups as to whether they have ancestral connection to Israel. That would be the Russians and the Medes.
The Russians and the who?
The Medes.
The Medes, the Russians and the Medes.
Thank you. Well, taking the Russians first, for those who follow my website, you will see that I regard Russia as the Gog, Magog, Meshech, and Tubal entity in Ezekiel 38, which is fairly common throughout Christendom's identifications. Meshech, the consonants are like Moscow. Tubal is from Japheth, as is Meshech. And Tubal, you can see that name in the city of Tobal, or the Tobalsk River. There's geographical features that have that name. Magog is a name that used to be on South Russia. However, having said that most of Russia is Japheth, there are parts that clearly are from Shem, and there's clearly Israelites living in western Russia. The Vikings, when they were called the Varangians, I believe, came down through the area of Leningrad and followed the Volga River, etc. In fact, the Vikings and the Nordic people of Europe who were Israelites founded Kiev in the Ukraine, and the Vikings traveled up and down there in trade routes, founding cities. That's why you have blue-eyed blondes, in the Ukraine or in Russia, because they date back to the heavy involvement of the Israelites at that time from the Nordic regions. Also, there was an empire of Caucasians called the Khazars living north of the Black Sea, which at my website I have an article on the Khazars, or there's people who say that, for example, that the modern Jews aren't really Judah, they're Khazars. Well, the Khazars were Israelites, and there were Jews there, but the Jews were far more scattered than just in Khazaria. In fact, most of the Khazars never did adopt Judaism. It was mostly the elites of Khazaria, of the royal court, that did. And but from that background, too, there were Israelites that stayed in that Black Sea region for a very long period of time. So you will find some obvious Semitic and Israelite Nordic blood in the western Russia. Also, Catherine the Great, an empress of Russia, invited many Germans to come into the area that she ruled in the Russian Empire to settle in the Ukrainian region and become farmers and that. So a large mass of Israelite blood moved into the Russian Empire at that time in more modern history. Now, in terms of the Medes, that area has come up in a few questions at my website too, but when you look in the book of Daniel and combining it with secular history, the secular historians refer to the Medo-Persian Empire as being one entity, the Medes and Persians as being like a common people. In the book of Daniel, for example, these great Persian kings were Medes. It says in Daniel 11, in the first year of Darius the Mede, but Darius the Mede was a Persian king, because the second verse says that after Darius will stand up 3 more kings in Persia. So these Persian kings, whether they were called Medo-Persians or not, they're pretty much the same thing in terms of their origin. So the Medes, I do not feel, were Israelites. Indeed, when the Israelites that did go into the Assyrian captivity were brought into Mesopotamia, it says that they were planted in the cities of the Medes, if you remember, in the biblical accounts. So since the Israelites weren't living there at the time they were moved, but the Medes were living there already, the Medes were non-Israelites who were living in the region of Persia and became part of the Medo-Persian Empire later. And in fact, the Medes, you can see their name comes from the Genesis 10 table of nations, where Madai is one of the sons of Japheth. Madai, or the Medes, the vowels change over time, but you have to go with the consonants of MD, and that's a perfect match. Madai, or the Medes, is how we pronounce it in our modern English. So I hope that answers your questions on the Russians and the Medes. Is there any other questions?
Yes, Steve, this will be the last question coming up.
This is a comment on a statement you made earlier that the Earth may possibly be older than 6,000 years. I don't have the word in front of me, but if we go back to Genesis 1, where it talks about darkness hovering over the face of the earth, if we look at, or if we take that as being planet Earth, and then we go back and look at day 4, when the Creator tells us that He placed the stars, the sun, and the moon in place at that particular day for a sign, or to call out the seasons, the signs, the Moedim, then that would mean in Genesis 1 that the planet Earth existed prior to all other heavenly bodies that we know of in existence. And I think that that is not correct. That doesn't make sense to me. I think maybe that there was something that existed in Genesis 1, but it was not planet Earth. Maybe it was a kingdom, a land that was in existence at that point that was referring to, but not what we know or consider to be planet Earth.
Okay, I think I'm on again. Now, keep in mind, when it says darkness covered the earth, remember one of the very first things God did in Genesis week is He separated the darkness from the light. So in other words, the light penetrated the darkness, and whatever light was coming from celestial bodies would have then again reached the surface of the earth. And He separated day and night so that there was again a light portion on the earth. Now remember in Genesis 1 where it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. There's other creation accounts in the Bible, like one is in Job 38, where God is answering Job, and He says, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth, etc.? And He says, when all the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. And when He said He first created the earth, He made clouds and so forth. If the earth had been made a destroyed hulk of wilderness that's just dark and worthless and lifeless, it doesn't make sense that all the morning stars sang together for joy at the time it was created. And so also we have the fact that the angels were created before mankind. Lucifer, we don't know how long he lived in a perfect state. It says he was in Eden, but he had clearly fallen and become Satan by the time he is the serpent talking to Eve in the garden. So there's been an awful lot of history gone by before that period reaches, and that is very shrouded to us. But it does say in Isaiah and Ezekiel, Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, it counts about the original angelic creation, and it mentions when Lucifer, who was created perfect, and in Eden and so forth, it says when he rebelled against the Most High, it says he ascended above the clouds as he was rebelling. This was long before mankind existed. And clouds means there's water vapor. It means there's an atmosphere. It means there's a water cycle of precipitation and so forth. It was a verdant earth. It was beautiful. It said Lucifer was in the Garden of Eden. I mean, it was a gorgeous place when God first made this. There's one scripture here. It's in my article at the website. You can find it there. The whole thing discussed in depth. And I know you've got places to go, so I'll be brief. But in Genesis 1:2, it says the earth became tohu and bohu. There's one verse in a different creation account in the Bible where it says God did not create the earth originally in that tohu bohu condition. He made it to be inhabited. And it was inhabited by angels for an indeterminate period of time before Lucifer led his group and ascended above the clouds to try to dethrone the Most High. And then the book of Jude says they were hurled back. They didn't keep their first estate. And there was a great war in heaven when this happened, and the earth became a darkened cinder, really. And my article, Is the Earth 6,000 Years, goes into all of these scriptures that have to pertain on the beginning. So I'll leave it to you to go back in that and check it if you want. But I do think that there was an awful lot of Earth's history that occurred before creation week ever existed and mankind was on this earth. So with that, I will conclude and thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you again this year via the electronic media. And I look forward to speaking to you on the last great day of the feast on a message that I think you will find very encouraging and thought-provoking. So thank you very much.
I don't care how many times I've heard the shofar. If it's a good blast or not such a good blast, it's always a delight, isn't it? Wow, it's an awesome sound, and one day we're going to really hear how it's done. We'll all be called to order. So we're going to move really fast this morning because we're getting a really late start, and we got a really good speaker, and we got a whole mess of announcements that have come in. So let's move right through them if you wouldn't mind. So I'd like to get everybody in here